but we're now moving through to our third presentation of this particular panel. And this is Andrea Stanton. So if Andrea can take control and put the presentation on as I provide a little bit of background. Andrea is the Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Denver. And her research takes a lived religions approach. It focuses on 21st century Islam and the connections between digital media and contemporary piety. So lots of really interesting research there from Andrea, including an recent article on Hajj apps, which is something I'm also interested in, and possibly a unique article, I think, on the online debates over emoticon usage, which I remember from a few years ago. So do check out Andrea's work, and now I'm going to hand over to her for her presentation.
Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction. Also appreciate the shout out to my foray into debates over the legitimacy of emoticons, which I would just like to note, no scholar after like 7 years has done anything else with. So sometimes you start a conversation, sometimes you just talk with yourself. Anyway, I really appreciate having the chance to present today, and I'm really grateful for the chance to have been able to hear and learn from my colleagues in this panel and the previous panels. It's been really fantastic. I'm hoping to build on some earlier presentations and also to engage with some common themes. So personal piety, digital modalities, religious authority, state authority. So it's going to be a little bit of a shift from Rob's presentation, but I think we can hold it all together. And I'm hoping, yes, I will be happy to send my unloved, except by me, work on emoticons in the chat later. So I am, as the title creatively suggests, I'm going to focus today on a case study of Hajj and Umrah in the COVID era, and I'm going to do so with a kind of particular concern for how digital and governmental responses intertwine and how they extend pre-COVID practices and engagements. And just as a spoiler alert, I'm going to be making a pitch for paying more attention to Umrah. So let's see. Okay, so as Gary kindly noted, and also like our colleague, the future Dr. Patel, I also come from a lived religion perspective. In my home department, I'm known as somebody who's kind of allergic to some theory. So this is about as theoretical as I get. But I think that this also fits in with a lot of other conversations today, right? So we're looking at how individuals and communities kind of live out religious identities, beliefs, and practices in ways that connect with the kind of dates and doctrines approach, but don't necessarily stop there. And I'm interested in rituals, formal and informal, recognized and unrecognized, because I think they are a real key part of meaning making. Also, this is not just my insight, but I think that they are ways that we tell ourselves stories about our lives, ourselves, and the world we live in to kind of help make meaningful sense for us. And again, like many of us here, I'm also interested in digital religion. And as I tell my students, someday we'll just call this religion. And so here I just say I really appreciated Dr. Howard Bunt's kind of description of this in her presentation in panel 2 as kind of a continuum between online and offline engagements, online and offline selves. And I also liked her image kind of looked like a wrecking ball, which I thought was also kind of nicely appropriate for some of the ways in which online and offline engagements can be somewhat disruptive. And I'm also mindful again of Dr. Bunt's comment in his presentation about the ways that people, as we know, have very different kinds, levels, and abilities in terms of ability to access and participate in the digital world. So these are variegated rather than universal experiences. I think as part of digital religion, we might also think about processes of centering, recentering, and decentering. As we've heard today, digital technologies are often described as helping decenter authority, so in a way that empowers ordinary people or that distributes authority in kind of a capillary manner. And it's also, or maybe alternatively, described as personalizing or individualizing. So this, I think, connects with some of what Dr. Arjane was saying earlier about kind of the halal marketplace, or maybe the consumer model, right? Particularly with apps, you can download them, delete them, ignore them, shift to a different online platform, etc. In my case today, I'm actually going to be talking less about exciting new trends in decentered authority or empowering individual authority. I'm going to be talking more about the digital space as kind of a new platform for old authorities. So just sorry, I guess that's also a spoiler alert. And then, of course, my second conceptual frame is kind of about governmentality. So thinking about processes of how people are governed in a governmental sense, in a non-governmental sense, by channeling our behaviors. So not through a fear of punishment, by kind of a productive sense. And this can be done by governments or really by any kind of institution, large or small. And this idea comes from Michel Foucault, who is not always my favorite person, but I think that it is helpful to think about the ways in which governmentality and religion, big and large and small religion, can intersect, and particularly in the context of lived religion. So how people experience religion in everyday practices and behaviors, everyday interactions with religious and other institutions, and how this contributes to governmentality to the extent that it channels people's behaviors, identities, experiences, and dispositions. And I'd also like to suggest, and I'll come to this, that these processes that shape people's conduct can also be processes that are deeply meaningful from a spiritual and religious perspective. I'm just going to switch briefly here. Oops, maybe I'm not. Yes, I am. I'm going to switch. This is just a pretty quick visual overview or reminder. If you're familiar with these two pilgrimages, this would be a great time to check your email or get a cup of coffee. But for our purposes, I think some key distinctions here that we might think of between Hajj and Umrah are the foundational one of obligatory if possible versus meritorious or recommended, time limited versus any time of the year, longer versus shorter, more crowded versus less crowded. Dr. Arjane, in one of her books, talks about the Umrah as being seen by some people as kind of like a practice Hajj, or a Hajj without some of the risks or some of the unpleasant parts of the Hajj, crowding and greater duration and all that. So, but for those of us in religious studies or the academic study of Islam, I think we might also add another important distinction, which also connects with what Dr. Arjane Sophia was saying earlier. One is very well studied and one is pretty understudied. And at least in my surveys of Umrah scholarship, they tend to be located in public health journals and travel management journals. And when Umrah is mentioned in religious studies or Islamic studies scholarship, it tends to take a pretty distant backseat to discussions of the Hajj. Like there's long discussions of the Hajj, and then there's something about like a sentence, maybe a paragraph about Umrah. And that makes sense, again, going back to this distinction between obligatory versus meritorious. But I think it's also important to recognize that there's an increasingly prominent role or potential role that Umrah is being envisioned to play today. So again, just as a recap, I think this is probably not new for most of us. There are many Muslims in the world today, and Mecca is small. And so if we assume that the Hajj in non-COVID times can safely hold about 2.5 million pilgrims, and if we assume that there are about 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, that means that 0.15% of the global Muslim population can go on Hajj in any given year. So not very many. And I'm not trying to suggest that Umrah is being positioned as a replacement for Hajj, but I think to pick up on Rob's point about cyber pilgrimage, I think that what we see with Umrah is that it's being positioned as a spiritual supplement or as an augmentation, right? So given the constraints of Hajj. And I think we see this as part of the Saudi government's focus on Umrah in its strategic plan Vision 2030, which has a goal of increasing the annual number of Umrah pilgrims, from 8 million to 30 million annually. And so I'm focusing on Umrah because I think it's a really important area to watch in terms of intersections between lived religion, governmentality, and then actual like government things that the government is doing. So because I'm focusing on continuities, let me just give a really brief kind of potted sketch of pre-COVID state management efforts. Again, I think first, for those of you who are at all familiar with the histories of the Hajj, governments with Muslims have, since the later 1800s, been making considerable efforts to manage Hajj pilgrims. This is very deeply connected with colonial histories, also with histories of technology, starting with the steamship, but then it also becomes integrated into the 20th century, and it becomes integrated into the national history of Saudi Arabia. And that's where I'm going to leave it for time purposes. And then similarly, the integration of digital technologies into this process also well preceded COVID, primarily through a focus on public health and population management with the goal of keeping people alive while on Hajj, managing potential illnesses, accidents, deaths. And again, digital technologies are also pretty integral to Vision 2030 and connected with the ideas of kind of positive experiences for pilgrims. If we look at, similarly, kind of pre-COVID digital trends, separate from state efforts around Hajj and Umrah, we've of course seen a rise since the emergence of the smartphone in terms of user-focused, individual, believer-centered digital religious engagements, often around apps. And I will say that when I talk about religious apps, what I find is that people who don't personally use religious apps are totally baffled by the fact that this is an area that exists in the world. People who do use them, or people who know people who use them, realize that it's no different than, like my brother-in-law and his sports apps, or people who have banking apps or fitness apps, that we as humans, if we have digital access, tend to integrate what matters to us into our digital worlds. And of course, the we here includes people of various religious traditions, but given the demographics globally, Christianity and Islam have tended to be the most represented religions in terms of the app landscape. But to bring it back to my focus, people don't just give up the digital while on pilgrimage. And you may recall that Saudi authorities in the early 2010s, for example, went back and forth on this for a while, right? Which was kind of shorthanded as Hajj selfies, yes or no. But it turns out that people really do bring their whole selves and also their existing expectations around staying in touch with others, processing and sharing their experience to pilgrimages. And they bring the idea that they can read prayers and they can follow pilgrimage guides on their phones or on maybe a tablet rather than in a printed book. And so all of this, these kind of two different things have coalesced into the emergence over the past 12 years of pilgrimage-related apps, including the ones that were launched within the past 5 to 6 years by the Saudi Ministry of Hajj and Umrah. So we have two strands that are not entirely separate, but have been feeding into the COVID era context. Let me just check the time. Great. Okay. So then I'm just going to give you a quick sidebar. I had this lovely vision in my head that I was going to talk about how Hajj-related apps had really changed during COVID. And I'll just put this here as something we might talk about in the Q&A. I couldn't find anything when I searched for that. And then when I did kind of a sampling of apps that I could find or that I thought had traction as Hajj-related apps, most hadn't been updated since 2019, and only a few had been updated since 2020. So anyway, I have thoughts on that. We can probably discuss it afterwards, but it did change the topic of my presentation a little bit. Anyway, just highlighting visually, there are a lot of Hajj-related apps out there. Some are pilgrimage guides, some are simulations, some are prayer collections, some are wallpapers. There's a variety. And the same, there's also a lot of apps that include Umrah, although you will notice that many are Hajj and Umrah apps. Again, the Umrah gets a little less love than the Hajj. So let's see, how do I find the next slide? There we go. Okay, so I want to bring this all together in the next 7 minutes by looking at the Saudi Ministry of Hajj and Umrah's most recent app, Tamarna, which launched last September as part of the country's preparations for restarting the Umrah pilgrimage, which had been halted, obviously, due to COVID. And its primary function as an app is a kind of online reservation system. So it allows users to request permits to perform Umrah, to pray in the Grand Mosque of Mecca, to pray in the Rawdat al-Jannah, in the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and to do, I think, one other thing. And as of, I just checked again yesterday, and it had been still installed over 1 million times, at least for people who are accessing it through Google Play, nearly 78,000 reviews. A lot of those are critiques when something goes wrong technically, and it's been updated by the developers multiple times, right? So all of those three things to me suggest pretty active use. And thus far, app users have been effectively limited to Saudi citizens, residents, or approved visiting foreigners because the permit request requires either a residency number or an ID number. And it's also currently tied to the COVID situation because the permit request also requires that the requester first upload proof of vaccination or acquired COVID immunity through the country's contact tracing app, which also does testing of vaccination appointments, quarantine, and curfew clearance acts called Tawakkalna. This is the one that you would use if you were in Saudi Arabia to go on Umrah, but it also requires interfacing with a whole network of interlinked government apps. And so that's what I want to highlight, that there's one app for Umrah, which fits with the Ministry of Hajj's existing apps on user-focused and business-focused on Hajj and Umrah, but this one also somewhat more overtly than some others connects users or requires users to also be connected to these other kind of interlinked government apps. So for Tamarna users, people who want to use that app for Umrah, the most important is this Tawakkalna app, which basically kind of governs people's abilities to move around. And then Tabad indicates exposure to people with confirmed COVID cases. So it's kind of like your exposure notification if you have that on your US cell phone. And then quarantining people, so people who may have arrived from outside the country, check in daily with Tataman. And then the other apps here are more institutional in their operations. And many of these apps also interface with another app called Abshar, which is the government's main mobile services app. It's best known in the United States from a few years ago as the app that allowed men acting as guardians to prohibit women from leaving the country. But that was simply because it's the main government services portal electronically. Initially, Tawakkalna required an active Abshar account. Tamarna requires one too. So basically, Umrah currently triangulates users between three government apps. And I was thinking that it's really kind of a displacement of bureaucracy into the digital realm rather than a replacement of bureaucracy. In any case, what I want to turn to, thank you, in my last few minutes, I want to just close by looking anecdotally at one person's experience of these intertwining apps. So the writer here, this is from a piece on a kind of academic public scholarship blog called The Conversation, and I chose it because I thought that the person's experience with pilgrimage was quite interesting. So the writer is a pathologist based at the University of Nairobi who describes himself as going on Umrah at least once per year and as having gone on Hajj twice. And I don't have quantitative data for this, but it seems like quite a lot to me. So, and he explains that he'd been avoiding travel to limit possible COVID exposure, but that he felt comfortable going after learning about the Saudi public health measures. And so in this particular piece, which I've pulled out some highlights that talk more about the apps, he doesn't speak as much about the spiritual aspects of Umrah, although if you follow Calabi on Twitter, the religious aspects of pilgrimage for him are much more clear. But he does explain that the Umrah guide for his group told them what apps to download and how to use them. He does also acknowledge that there may be some privacy concerns around apps that retain people's individual and medical data and connect it to their movements. But overall, I think what I see here is a case, again, anecdotally, in which one person's lived experience of religion through a major pilgrimage ritual connects with this kind of productive shaping of people's conduct, which is being managed by a kind of array of government ministries via this kind of intertwining network of apps. And so I'm just going to leave that there. Again, anecdotal is something to think about. And again, what other place to look for this is in the user reviews, although user reviews, at least for Tamarna and Tawakkalna, tend to love the app when they work. And so their complaints are mostly about tech issues rather than about privacy violations. Anyway, so if we're going to zoom out a bit, what might we take away in terms of what's been happening and what might continue to happen? And so again, I'd like to sell everybody on the importance of looking at Umrah, both as a kind of spiritual supplement for people who may not be able to go on Hajj, and for the Saudi government as kind of a test space, both that fits their economic goals, but also allows them to kind of test out other things in terms of digital population management, public health management. And so I would take this from my perspective as a reminder for us that while those of us who work on the digital think about shifts in authority and new authorities, that we might still want to pay attention to old authorities, and that we also might want to look at continuities and evolutions as well as ruptures when we look at the impact of COVID on things like religious ritual and pilgrimage. So I will happily close there and say thank you very much again. I really appreciate the chance to be part of this conference.